Hello everybody, my name is Andre and welcome back to Conquer School. Today we are going to be talking about structure and the properties of water according to the IB curriculum. The reason why we're talking about water here today is because water is the main component of all living things. Cells are about 80% water. So what are the main components here and why is water so unique to the properties and the structure of life? We're going to talk about cohesion of water, or the surface tension, that's also called adhesion, which essentially is bound by the same properties. It is that water tends to be sticky to itself. When you have a water droplet that is just hanging from a faucet, how come it does not drop down? It needs to first develop into a big enough droplet to be pulled down by gravity into the sink. Well, the reason for that is because of cohesion and adhesion properties of water. So we're going to discuss why those exist. We're also going to talk about the unique thermal properties of water. Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and it boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This is very unique as the range here is quite large, and the majority of substances would not be within that range in order to facilitate these thermal properties. So it is very difficult to heat up water. It takes a lot of energy, and it's also not that easy to cool it down. And in addition, we are going to discuss the solvent properties of water. Now, in order to discover why these properties exist, we will first have to study the molecular structure of water. So water has bent shape because of these lone pair electrons that oxygen has. So originally oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell, so 6 covalent electrons. The hydrogens have 1 covalent electron, and they're not stable because they do not fulfill the octet rule. Octet rule states that atoms must have 8 electrons in their valence shells in order to be stable. So neither of these atoms on their own are going to be stable, and they continuously seek stability. So the hydrogen will bond with the oxygen in order to seek that stability, in order to fulfill its octet. Now, the type of bond that they possess between hydrogen and oxygen is called a covalent bond. And this type of bond is where we have the sharing of electrons. So essentially, the 6 electrons that oxygen possesses in the valence shell are being shared with 1 electron each from the hydrogen. And when they are shared, essentially, each of the molecules thinks it's got more electrons than it normally did. So the hydrogen had 1 electron originally, but now because it's sharing another electron with the oxygen, it now thinks it's got 2. And the oxygen thinks it's got hydrogen's electron because they're being shared. Now the same thing is happening with this hydrogen, and now the oxygen believes it's got 8, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Each covalent bond possesses 2 electrons. And each hydrogen believes it contains 2 electrons now. So they're both stable. Now here's where the majority of properties come in. It is based on the electronegativity difference between oxygen and hydrogen. The triangle here means difference, and En stands for electronegativity. So electronegativity is the measurement of the ability of an atom to attract electrons. So obviously the hydrogen and the oxygen will have different abilities to attract electrons to themselves. So if we take a look at a table that possesses electronegativities of each element, well, the oxygen is going to have 3.4 electronegativity. And by the way, electronegativity ranges anywhere from 0 to 4. So 4 would be high electronegativity, 0 would be very low. At 3.4 is oxygen, so it's quite high. It's very close to 4. However, hydrogen has electronegativity of about 2.2. So they're going to have a difference in electronegativity of 1.2. And whenever the difference in electronegativity is anywhere between 0.5 and 1.5, we have a polar covalent bond. So our water molecule here is going to possess polar properties. And what do we mean by polar? Well, this is an indication that the 2 electrons that are being shared in the covalent bond are not shared equally, because the oxygen has a greater pull of those electrons than the hydrogen. Now, because of oxygen's greater pull for those electrons, it is going to gain a partially negative charge. Conversely, the hydrogens are going to have a partially positive charge. And this forms polarity due to the unequal sharing of electrons in the covalent bond. And we will be learning more about electronegativity and the electronegativity difference and its significance in the chemistry section later on. So the reason water possesses its unique properties are primarily due to its polarity. So let's discuss how this polar covalent molecule of water will pertain to its cohesion, surface tension, and adhesion. Now, as you can see, when we have plenty of these water molecules, they're going to create cohesion and adhesion, meaning that they're going to stick together due to their partial positive and negative charges. So the partially negative oxygens are going to have an attraction to the partially positive hydrogens. Now, the bonds that I have created here in yellow are called hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are weak intermolecular attractions. Intermolecular meaning that they are between molecules. So each molecule has covalent bonds. That's intramolecular because it's within a molecule. Now we're talking about intermolecular forces that are between molecules. So each water molecule is going to be bonded to other water molecules due to hydrogen bonds. And I mentioned that they are weak. They are weak compared to covalent or ionic bonds that are intramolecular. However, when there are plenty of these hydrogen bonds, and as you can see, there's just an abundance of these bonds, they actually have very, very significant strength among them. Now let's talk about the thermal properties of water. Now, in order to break these hydrogen bonds and make water from liquid to gas, for example, we would need lots of energy. Now, due to the fact that we need high amount of energy to break such abundance of hydrogen bonds, water possesses a property of high specific heat capacity. And essentially what this means is that it requires lots of heat to be absorbed by these molecules in order to raise the temperature by 1 degree Celsius. So each degree Celsius that we want to raise the water temperature, we would have to implement a certain amount of heat. Now, that amount of heat is actually very high compared to other substances. Relatively, it is very high. We would need to input lots and lots of heat in order to raise it by 1 degree Celsius. So essentially, water with these thermal properties and the high specific heat capacity, it acts like a temperature buffer. And what do we mean by buffer? It means that it keeps things very constant. It doesn't change very much. So essentially, it is very difficult to raise the temperature and it is difficult to lower the temperature. So it's a stabilizer. It stabilizes the temperature needed for living organisms to exist and to fulfill their functions. Our bodies operate most optimally at 37 degrees Celsius of core temperature. Now, that can vary from anywhere from 35 to 42. Now, if it goes anywhere outside of that range, then we're in the fatal zone of organ failure. Now, water, since the majority of our cells are water and the majority of our bodies are water, we're able to maintain this 37 degrees and the fluctuations aren't going to be that great. So even if the environment outside is extremely hot, we're able to use our properties and our homeostatic functions in order to maintain the 37 degrees internally. And this also occurs when there's freezing temperatures outside. We're still able to maintain the 37 degrees Celsius at the core because it is difficult to change the temperature of water as it acts like a buffer, a stabilizer for the core temperature. Now, another unique thing about the thermal properties is that, for example, if the person is getting hot and the body has to maintain 37 degrees Celsius, water is going to act like a coolant for the body when the person sweats, because water is going to carry lots of heat energy, and when the sweat comes out of the body, it is essentially releasing that heat. So water is going to carry the heat energy outside of the body, and this is why the surface is going to be very hot. However, internally, your temperature will still remain 37 degrees Celsius. Next, let's discuss water's solvent property. The majority of chemical reactions within the body are carried out in an aqueous medium. An aqueous medium simply means that it's in a solution. Water is considered the universal solvent as it is able to dissolve a variety of different substances. Now, the majority of macromolecules and their monomers, such as amino acids or carbohydrates or salts, they're going to be dissolved in a polar solution, and water is the perfect example of that. Water is polar and is going to be a polar solvent. So whenever we have proteins being broken down, we have carbohydrates being broken down, or salts, water is the perfect medium for those reactions. As the famous saying goes, like dissolves like. This simply means that polar dissolves polar and nonpolar dissolves nonpolar. Now, the majority of the substances, as I mentioned in living things, are going to be polar and they're going to be dissolved in our water aqueous medium. So how does this happen? Well, if, for example, we had salt, NaCl, just a regular table salt, being dropped in a cup of water, it is going to dissolve because of the polarity of water. Sodium and chlorine are going to become ions. They're going to be aqueous. And they're going to become ions because there is a complete transfer of electrons in an ionic bond, where the sodium gives up its electron to the chlorine. This is why it's got a negative charge, and the sodium has a positive. And that bond is going to dissociate because water has partial charges of its own. And so the negative charges of the oxygens are going to surround the sodium with the positive charge. And the positive charges, the partial positive charges of hydrogens are going to surround the chlorine. And they're essentially going to split these molecules apart, which is why it does not maintain its solid state. This concludes our lecture for today. Thank you for joining, and I'll talk to you soon.